Hello, Eternal Life fans. It's Rowan from the Eternal Life Fan Club. And today I wanted to respond to some points that my roommate made. Okay, my roommate, if you don't know, he's the one who wears the glasses. He's always wearing these like hipster glasses. Anyways, he said a lot of really, this stuff is pretty, I just want to respond to this stuff. I disagree with a lot of this stuff. Okay, so first he's talking about Sam Harris. I guess my roommate, he hasn't explicitly said that Sam Harris is his spiritual teacher, but I'm putting two and two together, and I can kind of see that Sam Harris is probably his spiritual teacher because he's always talking about Sam Harris. He's kind of obsessed with Sam Harris, and he did come from a Sam Harris meditation retreat, so it wouldn't surprise me if Sam Harris is his spiritual teacher. But first thing he said here is, Sam Harris, he showed me the light. He taught me all the ancient meditation practices of the Buddhist monks. So first of all, let's talk about Buddhism a little bit. So what does Buddhism preach that I'm against? Buddhism preaches non-attachment philosophy. Okay, that's what Buddhism preaches. It's like this idea that you can avoid suffering, you can alleviate suffering by not being attached to things, okay? This is what non-attachment philosophy is. It's to minimize suffering in your life by just stopping with attachment, okay? And really that's the opposite of what I preach. I preach, that attachment is good if you're being attached to the right things, right? We want to be attached to life itself. We want to be attached to our eternal life. So when taking this non-attachment philosophy to, the logical conclusion of that is that non-attachment to life itself. And then that's why you find a lot of Buddhists and Buddhist preaching, those types of people who get into that, they lose their fear of death, okay? Non-attachment leads to fearlessness, okay? Because if you're not attached to any outcome, or if you're not attached to any goals, if you're not attached to life itself, you might start to lose your fear of death, because you won't see that as being a problem. It's a lazy way of thinking. It's a lazy philosophy because, sure, maybe you would have less suffering. If you delude yourself into thinking that you shouldn't be attached to things, really that's a delusion. Because we're attached to things for a reason. It's because they have value. If I'm attached to a particular relationship, if I'm attached to something, it's usually because it's a valuable thing. That's why I'm attached to it. So to just lose your attachment to things is really a way of brainwashing yourself, kind of giving yourself a mental lobotomy, so you can just lose all your attachments. So you won't have to suffer as much. But that's a lazy way of thinking. When you think about it, it's actually a harder way to go through life is to be attached to all these things that you perceive to have value, because they really do have value, and then you have to work for them. You have to work to maintain those things. Let's say it's a relationship. Maybe you're attached to a relationship. Is that unreasonable to be attached to a relationship that you think has value? No, that's not unreasonable. That's what we should do. We should be attached to things that matter, that are important. Okay, what if I'm attached to the idea of helping other people? There's an attachment, but the Buddhists would say, oh, don't be attached, because then what if you can't help other people? What if you end up not helping other people? Then you'd have suffering if you were ever attached to the concept that you should be helping people. But I'm saying it's worth suffering for. It's worth suffering for attachments. So maybe, yeah, you're attached to a lot of things, you have a lot of goals that you're attached to. Maybe you don't make some of those goals. Despite your attachment, maybe you're still going to fail at some goals in life, and you're going to have to suffer because you were attached to those goals that you had failed at. But it's still a good thing to be attached to those goals, because the attachment itself is what's going to help you reach those goals. Me being attached to eternal life is going to help me reach eternal life. It's that attachment, that desire, that is so important. And that's why the whole Buddhist non-attachment philosophy is a bunch of crap. So that's my first issue, is like, and it's kind of always annoyed me, Sam Harris really does, he really does promote a lot of Buddhist stuff. His mind has been infected with a Buddhist perspective on things. A Buddhist, he's supposedly just an atheist, right? So, but really he has been infected with a Buddhist way of thinking that I think clouds his thinking. I don't think it's really intelligent. Because if you really get into what Sam Harris preaches, he's really against fear, against the fear of death. He's just against fear in general. He thinks it's like a bad thing. So it's no wonder that my roommate has completely lost it. Okay, he's gone off the deep end philosophically wise. Okay, regarding his philosophy and everything, it's gotten pretty crazy. And it doesn't surprise me, because when you listen to when you're a spiritual teacher, when you're idolizing people who say something like this, you're going to have a bad time when you start getting into the mindset that the self is an illusion. Where do you come up with that idea? That's like directly from Buddhist. That's like a Buddhist mindset right there, that the self is an illusion. I mean, what are the consequences? What are the ramifications of thinking that yourself is an illusion? I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous thought. I mean, why just say that we're an illusion? What's the point of that? As far as I can see, myself is not an illusion. I'm real. I have a real consciousness, a self. Where do you get the idea that the self is an illusion? What's the point of saying something like that? What's the purpose of saying that? Where does that lead anyone to? Because as far as I can see, if someone starts to think that their self is an illusion, that could lead them to doing stupid things. Because if they're just an illusion after all, what does it matter what they do if they're just an illusion? Or if everyone else is just an illusion, what does it matter what they do? Or what does it matter what you do to them? If we're both just an illusion here, if we have no self, if they have no self, if nobody in the world has a self, what's the purpose? What's the usefulness of that philosophy? I don't get it. Explain that to me. In the comments, please explain to me what would be the usefulness of a philosophy that says the self is an illusion, as Sam Harris puts it. Because to me, that's just, it sounds almost like woo-woo. We hear the idea of woo-woo and something that like, it sounds intellectual. Oh, it sounds smart. Oh, the self is an illusion. But it's just a bunch of crap. It's just a bunch of like, what's he saying? Why is he saying that? Okay? Where do you get that idea? That Buddhist mentality has bled over into, the world of intellectuals, and it has fallen right onto Sam Harris. He now is preaching these Buddhist ideas. I have to wonder how much of Sam Harris's thought is really thought out, or it's really just kind of stolen from Buddhism. It's really not his own thing. It's like a lot of what he says is regurgitation from Buddhist philosophy. So it's no wonder, and it's no surprise to me, that you find someone like Sam Harris, talking about the present moment, focusing on the present moment. This is right out of Buddhism. Buddhism, meditation, all these things that Sam Harris talks about. And then he has this lecture called Death and the Present Moment, in which he concludes that really, death isn't the problem, life is the problem.
The good news of atheism, the gospel of atheism, is essentially nothing. That nothing happens after death. There's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to fear. When after you die, you are returned to that nothingness that you were before you were born. But if we are right, and nothing happens after death, death, therefore, is not a problem. Life is the problem.
That's Sam Harris's conclusion. It's because his mind has been infected with the mind virus of Buddhism, and he can't think for himself that no, death is the problem. Okay, and why does he say that something like death isn't the problem, life is the problem? Because that is right in alignment with Sam Harris's overarching philosophy that leads him. And it's the kind of the root of his philosophy, which is avoidance of suffering. Okay, Sam Harris really has a problem with suffering, and he thinks it's like the goal to alleviate suffering in the world, for the most amount of people, and alleviate suffering for yourself. And when that is at the top of your priority pyramid, the alleviation of suffering as being like the most important thing ever, that's going to lead you into this type of philosophy that Sam Harris has. Because the reason he says that, the reason Sam Harris says that death isn't the problem, life is the problem, because in that whole context, what he's talking about is that when you're alive, you have to suffer. That is, the suffering comes with being alive, and really, when you're dead, you won't have to suffer. There'll be no suffering in death. You won't have a consciousness. You'll just have ceased to exist. You'll be done. No suffering with death. And so that's I think that mindset of trying to avoid suffering, it has led Sam Harris literally to not even be attached to life itself. Because if Sam Harris had attachment to life itself, he wouldn't say something like that, if nothing happens after death, death therefore is not the problem, life is the problem. That is really right in alignment with Buddhism, the Buddhism teaching of non-attachment, and the whole focus in Buddhism about alleviating suffering. That really, in Buddhism, suffering is this big problem, and in Buddhism, you want to stop suffering. That's really an important priority in Buddhism, the way I understand it. But in my way of thinking, suffering really isn't the biggest problem here. Okay, the problem is ceasing to exist. The problem is to die. Death is the biggest problem. And really, it'd be worth any amount of suffering to avoid death. So you see, I have a different set of priorities. I have a different set. So at the top of my pyramid, the priority isn't to avoid suffering. At the top of my pyramid, the priority is to live forever. Even if you had to suffer a lot in order to live forever, that amount of suffering would be completely worth it, because I've given a price to a value to eternal life, and that value I've given to eternal life is infinite, and an infinite amount of value to this eternal life. So you'd be willing to do any kind of suffering. You'd be willing to suffer to any extent in order to live forever. So that's really not Buddhism at all. It's very different than Buddhism. And it's very different than Sam Harris's entire philosophy, which I think sucks for the most part. And how can I say that Sam Harris's philosophy, his entire philosophy, sucks? It's not just from the things he says, it's from the things he doesn't say. It's the thing, why isn't he talking about eternal life being the most important priority? And really, it's his focus. He's kind of focusing on all this other weird stuff. He talks a lot about meditation and all this stuff. And even his focus on meditation, what does that have to do with? Really, why is he focused on meditation in the first place? It's because he's so obsessed with this idea of avoiding suffering. And with Sam Harris, this idea of meditation, that is a technique of his to avoid more suffering. Because he thinks if he can just stop focusing on all his thoughts and just turn off the mind and just focus on this meditation, then he won't have to suffer. He won't have to suffer with all these invasive thoughts and these stressful thoughts. And this is the whole root of why people meditate in the first place. It's all just this strategy to avoid suffering. But you know what I think would be a better thing instead of meditating? How about actually turning your brain on, using your brain? Really, meditation is kind of a waste of time. How about using your brain, thinking the stressful thoughts? And what are stressful thoughts? Thoughts of death. But that's a good thing. You want to be thinking about death, because thinking about death will lead you to thinking about how to avoid death, how to live forever. It'll focus you, it'll fixate you on, how to, your eternal life strategy. developing your eternal life strategy, thinking about all the different possibilities. You want to be attached to eternal life. First and foremost, attach yourself to eternal life. And don't accept anything less. Don't accept anything less than eternal life for yourself. Thank you. And may you live forever.